Well, welcome to Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. And tonight we have a very special guest online with us. The gentleman online with us is a man that I've had on my radio show on the Micro Effect before, and his name is Tom Ertl. And Tom is a home builder from Tallahassee, Florida, and he is also a very accomplished writer. He has written a number of articles for News with Views, and he has a publishing company called the Zurich Publishing Company. And we will start into the program tonight with a discussion about what feminism is, and the title of tonight's program is Feminism, Is It a Tool of Globalism? And with that, Tom, I'd like you to maybe introduce yourself a little bit, and you can fill in some of the blank spots that I may have been a little bit short on, but you've been very active with the church community for a long time, and I want you to tell our listeners a little bit about some of the projects you've worked on.
Yeah, Dan, thanks for the honor of being on your show again. I've had just 45-year background in politics, served on various Christian boards and Christian ministries, usually dealing with in the political realm, all the way back in the mid or really late 80s with Freedom Council, with Pat Robertson's organization, and various other boards, and started a publishing company, and we're a publishing foundation, really, a Christian publishing foundation, dealing with Christian political theory, biblical law, how it applies to all of areas of life and thought, and dealing with areas of Christian worldview and how it applies to practical application in the culture. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's and one of the things that we try to stress on this show is the fact that our Constitution and our founding fathers, everything that they did with the Constitution, with a form of government that was created for us, was really centered around Christian faith and around, as they refer to natural law, the fact that all of our rights come from God. They don't come from individuals. They don't come from governments. They come from God. And the role of government really is just to protect those rights and to protect those rights under God. That was what our Constitution was based on, and I know that's something that you feel very strongly on. I'd like to really start this discussion because you and I have already had several discussions about how feminism and the women's liberation movement has become a new normal in American social culture over the past 50 years. And really the result is a destruction of the American, traditional American Christian family. And this is really challenging us as a nation. Joseph Stalin identified ways to destroy America, and this is a quote, America's like a healthy body. Its resistance is threefold. It's patriotism, it's morality, and it's spiritual life. If we can undermine these three areas, America will collapse from within, unquote. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and get into the discussion for tonight. One of your articles that you recently wrote for News with Views was an article about how birth rates and the future of Western Christianity was seriously in doubt because of the feminist movement. I'd like to go ahead and open that with how you would like to lead into that discussion.
Well, Dan, the article really flows well with your last comment about what the new normal is, how feminism really, in reality, has been one of the most unbelievably successful social changing movements in world history. You have, you've got about 7,000 years of world history recorded, give or take, and you have the feminist movement redoing how women think of what their role is, what their responsibility is to life and society, and you radically, from the early 60s, have radically changed how women think about themselves. And the issue of your comment on becoming the new normal, what the great fear is, and the headline of my article was Birth Rates in the Future of Western Christianity, is the influence of this new normal of feminism into the church, where you have young Christian women in the church that are not getting anything from the pulpit. They're not getting a biblical worldview on what a woman's role in society is from the Bible, from what God has created women to be. They're not getting any helps from the church on marrying early and raising children, which women have done for centuries on time. And it almost doesn't even matter the religion. Women have always taken this historic role in various religions. Of course, we would promote Christianity above them all, but they've taken this role to marry early, to have large families, and to be basically the foundation for the next generation that was to come of any civil society. So in the church, which is critical to the future of the country, you have young women who are not getting a biblical worldview, and they're going into their 20s and late teens in their 20s with a little bit of Christianity and a lot of socialism, a lot of feminism, a lot of an alien worldview, and it's affected greatly the birth rates, which are really down in the United States and especially in Europe and the whole Western world, and because feminism has prevailed and has carried the day, because the church is not doing enough to give the young women an alternative biblical view.
Well, and I think that the point of that, too, is that the church has really fallen down in teaching young women that the family is really the core of the church. Without a strong central family core, the church is dying as well. And we see that in the numbers and in the fact that so few families are regular church attendees anymore. And it just kind of seems like the whole thing is tied together. Is that the way you see it too?
Yeah, very much so. The subtitle of my article was "Where Have All the Grandchildren Gone?" Right. And so you have Christian young women that were the bulk work of any kind of biblical Christian society whose passion from the early days was family life, the family, and children, and we just don't have that anymore. We're losing it in the church because we've lost it in the world. So you got to look at what's the origins of this? Why has this affected the church so much? So you have to look at the whole feminist movement from the last maybe 100 years, 150 years. So you have the feminist movement. We got to talk about it. We got to talk. Why is this movement so powerful? Why is it so strong? Why has it shaped and reshaped how women think of themselves and what their role in society is? So you have, the general authors of feminism are going to go into three waves. You have the first wave back in the 1800s, late 1800s, in the women's suffrage movement. The second wave is what we really need to talk about, which was the most effective, and that would have been in the early 60s. And then the third wave is what we're experiencing after the 60s, maybe in the 90s, and the turn of the century to what we have now, which was a more radical type of feminism. But when you look at the influence, you have to go and deal with the second wave of feminism, which was the early 60s. So you have it in the United States. You have Betty Friedan. You have three real main characters in the U.S. and maybe one in France, four women. And the three in the United States would be Betty Friedan with her tremendously famous and highly influential book, The Feminine Mystique. I think it was in 1963. And then you have Bella Abzug, the politician from New York. And then you have course, Gloria Steinem, which was, many people don't even know this, was a CIA asset. And later, when, of course, obviously she wrote and was the editor and founder of Ms. Magazine, highly influential in the 70s. In France, you have Simone de Beauvoir, who wrote the famous book, The Second Sex. And all these women had a particular worldview to change how women viewed themselves, to get women out of the house, to get them in the workforce, to compete with men. And they had two things going for them. They had a willing media, and they had the great foundation. So, we have a phrase in the conservative movement, Dan, is follow the money. And you look at the foundations, and you look in the feminist movement, the Ford Foundation, but especially the Rockefeller Foundation, was extremely influential in funding women's programs and women's studies in multitude of universities all around the country, in key universities, and also other funding, including the CIA funding and helping back Gloria Steinem with Ms. Magazine. And you see the nefarious forces there of these globalist-type foundations with the purpose of funding feminism to get the women out of the home and have them stop having children like women have done for 6,500, 7,000 years. So that's the root of it. The second wave feminism was fabulously successful in their approach, in their strategy, and it's been very, very detrimental to American society and really the whole West. And if you don't have birth rates, you cannot continue a civilization. I'm reading through, on a side note, reading through Will Durant's History of Civilization, his 11 volumes on the subject. And he talks about the great empires of the past, the Persian Empire, and their success was in two realms. It was in a promotion of a strong military and birth rates. Will Durant mentioned birth rates. You can't have a progressing, increasing civilization without women being mothers and bearing, children. Just can't have it.
Well, and Tom, one of the centerpieces of globalism and of the move for global government is a huge reduction in the population of the world. If you follow UN Agenda 21, they're saying a reduction in population to fewer than 1 billion people. Well, we're over 7 billion right now, so that means a 93% reduction in the world's population. And I know that the governments have been promoting a reduced birth rate, but at the same time, a lot of these Islamic countries and a lot of the countries who are now immigrating illegally in every other way into our countries, including Western Europe and the United States, they have huge birth rates. And this is how we are going to lose our Christian culture, right?
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's interesting when you talk about the feminist movement and you talk about what you said about birth rates. You're not going to negate birth rates and lower them unless you have a negative view of children. This is critical. And this is where, when I talk about the feminist movement, the second wave in the 60s and 70s was unbelievably successful, they changed how women view children. And they changed it historically over time because the view of children from women was always positive. And now they turned it into a negative situation, like children was going to set them back. And when you look at Betty Friedan, I've got her book, The Feminine Mystique, and there in the front of the book there's reviews, little short quips on what people think about her book and her work and her life. And when you read these little reviews, you really understand how they were able to change the way women think of themselves and what their role in society, as I said before, was. Let me read you a couple of them. This is Michael Kazan, New Republic. No woman more than Betty Friedan was able to spur the feminist awakening in the 70s and 60s. One of the rare, this is from the community, the Spirit of Community of the Reinvention of American Society. One of the rare books we are endowed with only once in decades, a volume that launched a major social movement. Betty Friedan is the liberator of women and men. The Feminine Mystique, this is Ariana Huffington. The Feminine Mystique forever changed the conversation as well as the way women view themselves. In great numbers to celebrate this milestone work, which fundamentally altered the course of women's lives. And then the last one would be Marilyn Yolam of the History of the Breast. And she says, Betty Friedan's groundbreaking work and Simone de Beauvoir's Second Sex are the twin pillars on which the entire movement was constructed. And then you go on to other feminists like Robin Morgan and Mary Jo Bain and Helen Sullinger. Let me read a couple of these quotes. I think this will help the listener understand what. Here's the key with these quotes is it'll help the women today understand what the women in the 60s and 70s had to go through. And we all saw the shows, the nighttime shows, the talk shows, where feminism was embraced. It was promoted on the American media, and day in and day out, this is what women had to endure. Let me read some quotes here. I think it'll be helpful. Robin Morgan said, "We can't destroy the inequities between men and women until we destroy marriage." And she called marriage a slavery-like practice. Mary Jo Bain says this, "In order to raise children with equality, we must take them away from the families and raise them communally." Vivian Gornick, "Being a housewife is an illegitimate profession." Helen Sullinger, "We must work to destroy marriage. The end of the institution of marriage is a necessary condition for the liberation of women." And the last one I'll read is the famous or the infamous Gloria Steinem when she said this: "We don't just want to destroy capitalism. We want to tear down the whole effing patriarchy." So here you've got women in those time periods that we have witnessed in the 60s and 70s coming under this kind of attack. And the attack was at the woman in the 50s and 60s that was a housewife, that loved her position, understood her role in society, loved having children, loved having many children, and they wanted them to change how they thought about what their role was. And it was the barrage of the media was so successful. I mean, it just was just a world-changing movement in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. And needless to say, we need to mention Margaret Sanger, because she was really probably the start of that second wave. She was certainly after the first wave, but Margaret Sanger was one of the real strong proponents of eugenics. And when you look back at who was funding the eugenics movement, you're absolutely right. It was the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, the Harriman Foundation, the Carnegie Institute, Kellogg. So there were quite a few of these big funding corporations that were promoting this stuff all through the last century. And the result is, and you'll certainly mention this, the result is that at least in our American culture, without immigration, our birth rate is below the replacement rate. Am I correct?
Yes, and it is. And what's worse than the United States, of course, is the European countries. Italy, I mean, we use the word bambino. I use the word bambino in my article, which is an Italian word for male baby, and that birth rate is below the 2.1%, which is which is the percentage required to maintain the population growth. So you have absolutely drastic situation in the former Western European countries, and it's not really much better in the United States. You're right. Sometimes it's the legal and illegal immigration that's kept the population growing in this country. Mm-hmm. And I think too, what's interesting is that when you look at the leadership for the church, which is religion is critical. We have to when Christian societies, when women understand their biblical position in life, they're more apt to be family orientated and they're more apt to have children. So you see the situation in Russia, and I put this as very interesting. In Eastern Europe and in Russia, you see a change of events compared to concerning family, motherhood, and having children compared to the situation in the United States and in Western Europe. If you got time, let me give you a couple quotes. Mm-hmm. This is in all the things that are going on negative in the world and society, sometimes we have to mention some of the positive things. And sometimes the left, the socialists, the globalists can almost push their agenda so hard where they get a pushback. So you're seeing the pushback in Poland and Hungary, some of the Eastern European countries, and in Russia. Let me quote you. This is Viktor Orban, the Reformed Christian, dedicated Christian in Hungary, Prime Minister. He just won, 2 weeks ago, just won a big election.
Right.
Two-thirds, I think it was Dan, two-thirds of his party maintained control over the parliament there in Hungary. So here's his February 19th of this year State of the Union speech. And this is, quote, Viktor Orban. I believe that families form the unifying backbone of the entire country. I believe that everyone who commits to having children should be given all the support possible, and I believe that mothers must be respected and honored. And then he goes on to talk about how if Hungary is to maintain itself, it must stay Hungarian. In other words, he's rejecting all the immigration growth. And then, so they're realizing they have to push motherhood. They have to bring back Christianity. If their cultures are their centuries-old cultures are to survive. Let me give you a quote. I don't know if any of your listeners have watched the somewhat too long interviews by Megyn Kelly recently this year with Vladimir Putin, president of Russia. And what was interesting, I listened to all of it, and it was just fascinating. He really did a number on Kelly. I mean, it was interesting, Dan. Kelly was just kept harping about Russian collusion in the American election. He put his finger to his ear and he said to her, "Are you listening to me?" She just kept harping and harping, kind of embarrassing. But anyways, here's what he said about the situation in Russia today. So she asked him, "What do you see as some of your greatest accomplishments as president of Russia?" So he replied basically with comments about and stats about doubling the Russian economy and bringing millions of people out from under the poverty line. But then he said this, and this is Putin. He says, back in early 2000s, our population shrank by nearly 1 million people a year. Can you imagine the scale of this disaster? Almost 900,000 people. Then he goes on and says, we have reversed this trend. We have achieved a natural population increase. We have very low infant mortality. We have reduced maternal mortality to almost zero. We have prepared and are implementing a large-scale program of supporting mothers and children. Our life expectancy is growing at a high rate. So can you imagine an American politician with that kind of language in a speech? Mm-hmm. So this is Putin's, president of Russia's, comments about motherhood and about having children they're really part and parcel to the Christian renewal that's going on in the old Soviet Union and the Russian Federation as we know it today. So you can't have a Christian renewal unless you're going to have Christian children, unless you have a positive view of motherhood. So, there are positive things, and I think really I put in the article that the future leadership of the church is probably going to be, the way it seems, is Eastern Europe and Russia. I mean, and this is a little off subject here from what we're talking about, but they're going on in Russia. And you don't hear this in the anti-Russian, anti-Christian press in America or the Western world, but they're going on a massive government-cooperated church-building program, and I put this in the article in Russia. And the idea is for the Russian government and the people was so that the people would not have to drive to church, but could walk to church. So you see massive amount of churches in St. Petersburg and Moscow being built, and there's a purpose for this, because the government, along with the Russian Orthodox ministers and clergy, know that if the people get Christian instruction and go to church and come under the influence of the Bible, they are less likely to abort, they're more likely to marry, they're more likely to marry early, and they're more likely to have large families. So there is a motivation with the building of these churches, and you cannot separate. The more women get away from a biblical worldview and what God has called them to do, the less likely they are to have children. And the more likely they are to have, 2 children or fewer, or not even really. I think we really got a situation, Dan, where a lot of women are just late 20s and 30s and not even married, without any hope of marriage.
Right. No, you're absolutely right, and I see that trend. Your comment after the last radio show we did together, I was visiting with my neighbor who has 3 daughters who are all married, and they don't have any grandchildren. And the daughters are now in their late 20s, early 30s, and only the youngest daughter is having children. And I asked him about that, and he said, well, they've been indoctrinated by all the talk about how family is not as important as career. And so they have spent their whole adult lives getting educated and getting a career, and they have absolutely no interest in having children. And he was quite sad about it. The youngest daughter is the only one that's having children, and she's got, they just had their second grandbaby. So at least one of the girls has got enough sense to realize that the family name will die if they don't have children.
Yeah, you're totally right. In fact, that's interesting you brought that up, because the theme of the article was the story that I brought out of my friend in Iowa who I sent him some stuff of what I just mentioned about how the Russian church and the Eastern European churches are promoting motherhood and promoting large families and having children. And he was out, a similar story to what you're talking about. He was out at a restaurant on Friday night in Iowa, northwest Iowa, and they were waiting to be seated, and 2 older women who haven't seen each other in 10 years, and you can pull it up in the article to get it exact, haven't seen each other in 10 years, and one of them started talking about their 2 grandchildren. So the one said, well, how many grandchildren do you have? He says, I don't have any. And you know what? I don't think we're ever going to get any grandchildren out of her 2 children. So my friend sat down with his wife, and he said this. He said it was one of the most soul-searching, difficult things, saddest things. He really said saddest things we've heard, my wife and I have heard in years, of a woman in a Christian part of northwest Iowa not really ever going to have any grandchildren. So he made a comment. He said he really felt like telling the 2 ladies, well, how has the sexual revolution and feminism of the 70s and 60s worked out for you? The other thing he thought of saying was, I have 22 grandchildren. Can I borrow one to you for over the weekend? And and I thought that was kind of cute, but he just kept his mouth shut. He was a good conservative, didn't say anything, and sat down. But it really is a sad situation. Bringing your story up, I think one of the most critical paragraphs I put in this article was it was a subtitle, Feminism, a Hard Taskmaster. And let me read this one paragraph. And it talks about, and I write about women in their 20s. The key decade for a young Christian woman is in her 20s. And what is she going to do with it? Now, let me grab a sip here. The feminist movement is going to say, you're in your 20s, get an education, enjoy college, get a job, get a career, have multiple relationships, enjoy your sexual freedom, and get a new car and get a dog. I mean, basically, is what so many of these women do. So I said, this is what I said in the article. Quote, the critical decade of a woman is in her 20s. This is the time when great families are created. Is now spent on temporal things that fade like all other vanities. The modern woman spends her 20s cheating God's order with personal-driven activities of a job, amusements, multiple relationships, a new car, a dog, and travel, all of which of these things in previous civilized societies were reserved for a time after their family was raised. These were often the best days in a married couple's lives, times of travel, personal pursuits, endless grandchildren events. The woman who buys into feminism in her 20s, will never experience this because she'll not be able to get back that lost critical decade nor control her biological mortality. And that is reality, Dan, and it is sad. But, again, I always come back to the pulpit, the Christian ministers. Why are they not talking about this? Why are they not dealing with feminism? Why are they not giving the women in their church, the teenage women, the biblical alternative to what historic and biblical role that women had and the responsibility to carry on the next generation? They're not getting it. So these Christian women are leaving these churches in their 20s, many of them not even coming back to church after they go through college, and they've got a worldview mix of a little Bible, a little bit of grandma and grandpa and mom and dad's worldview, and a whole lot of feminism mixed and jumbled up together into their modernistic worldview. And a lot of times you see no difference in the church with these young women in their 20s than you do see the women in the world that don't have faith. And it is just a sad situation. And it really, I can't stress enough the era of the 20s. My mother had 6 kids. I'm the oldest of 6. She was full Italian. Of course, I'm half. And all of her children, all of from me, I think she was 23, and the last one was, she had quite a bit of them in a row here, 6 kids in 7.5 years, which is a little tough there, I guess. But from 23 to basically 31 is when all my siblings were born. And the modern woman is not marrying even in that period of time. And then her biology catches up with her. So really, the emphasis in that one little paragraph there was they are cheating God's creative order. You can't overcome your biology, whether you're a man or a woman. And, for a woman, those late teen years and those 20 years was the years where families were born and great families were born. And it's too bad the modern woman is cheating that. And then so you don't have what our parents had, and you don't have what our grandparents had, where they're in their mid-50s, their 60s, all the kids are gone, right? They're gone out of the house. They've had 4, 5, 6 kids. They're all gone. And they have started homes themselves and families themselves, and they're having a great time. I mean, I looked at my mom and dad, my parents who are deceased, and their best time in their life was when all of us kids were gone. And they were able to travel and enjoy themselves. And this is just true in any society, in any civilization in the past, because they had the children when they were younger. So we've got a disconnect going on.
We do, and one of the things that you're relating to is humanism, and the fact that under socialism or under communism, they really teach that there is no God, and that people can do pretty much what they want without repercussions. And one of the things that come out of humanism is, again, that you can have multiple relationships, you can just go out and have a lot of fun, and family is not part of that culture. But boy, there's sure a lot of these people that are in now their 40s that can no longer have kids, and I think a lot of them really regret it because they realize that their life is going to be empty. As they get to be old, there's not going to be anybody there that gives two hoots about them.
Well, and you're talking about, listen, here's the reality of what you just said there. The women that cheat God in their 20s and go through this feminist routine in their life and have this feminist worldview, you're right. They end up with a situation where they've got a nice house, cars, career, money to travel, and no children, or a few children. And like the lady in Iowa was testifying, no grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And my mom, my siblings, all six of us talk, and we all kind of concluded that my mother's life was extended 10, 12 years just for the joy of having children and grandchildren. I don't know what the grandchildren count was, probably 17, 18, and then she was able even to see, I think, a few of her great-grandchildren. But for a woman to know that she produced, 6 children, 17 grandchildren, I mean, she can die with a smile on her face, mm-hmm. compared to the feminist who basically has very few to little children. But what you're talking about is, here's what we got to get into this subject. This is really critical. So you've got second wave feminism that started in 63. So what have we got? 55 years of feminism since Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique. And now, you and I are not experts on this subject, but we are intelligent enough. We can look back in history, and anybody can look back and say, okay, how has this alien worldview of feminism, what has this produced? Okay, and, we've talked enough about, the negative birth rates and the consequences of this, but what has this produced in women? Are women happy? You have to ask this question, are they happy? And all the indication is absolutely they're not happy with the results. They're dying earlier. They're, with feminism comes a more masculine approach to a woman's life. The less feminine a woman is, the less attractive she is to men, all right? Call that sexist, call it whatever you want, but it's a true reality of 7,000 years of human history, 7,500 years. And when she promotes a feminist agenda in her personal life, she has a less likelihood of being married because she's not really attractive to men. And so, and God has created in women a passion for relationship, so much more than a man. And this is the great thing of how women in Christian societies are honored and adored and greatly appreciated, because I put in my article, women run the relationship business, the dating business, the marriage business, and the baby business. This is what they do. They are, we would not have a continuation of society without him. And so you're creating you're creating a worldview where women don't have these relationships at the end of their life. And Al Mohler, the Baptist minister who runs Southern Seminary in Louisville, had an article I've got here back to October 23rd of 2009, and he talks about the title of the article is "Feminism Unfulfilled: Why Are So Many Women Unhappy?" And he goes through length on how all these reports and all these studies have come out, how what feminism has cost women, and it's cost them even physically, where they don't have the longevity, the lifespan that normally women had when they were mothers and homemakers, and because they're put in a man's world, they're put in a more of a stressful situation, and they're in many times much more conflicting situations personally in their life, in business, and all of that. And so the whole women's revolution, as we call it, the whole feminist movement, has not made, after 55 years, has not made them any happier. And then there's reports. Here, this is interesting. You know, and we never talked about it here in our discussion, but you can't have the feminist movement where marriage is delayed unless there's a sexual revolution. So with the sexual revolution, we've had, you know, birth control, free sex, women being the pursuance of sex where they weren't before in other civilized societies, especially in our country and Western world. And so the sexual revolution goes along with feminism. So with free sex, a woman is allowed basically now practically to delay marriage, delay having children, and have her sexual fun and her sexual pursuits. So you have, and you know, all this came about through, you know, with over time with the birth control pill, and we could talk about that at length. But let's think about this thing. With the sexual revolution and birth control, there's all kinds of articles about weight gain. I mean, it's just maybe it's a minor thing, but it's an issue that a reaction to a key element of the sexual revolution, which is birth control. And with abortion, meaning women had abortion because they're anti-children, children is inconvenience to their life. So now we have studies out that abortions increase cancer risk in women. You have high sexual transmitted diseases in women because of the sexual revolution, HIV risk. And then maybe the worst of all, Dan, is with the abortion, the premarital sex, and the birth control, you have a huge increase in the infertility of women in their late 20s and early 30s.
Right.
So, I mean, so this whole element of what we're just talking about, you sum it up, 55 years of feminism, 58 years. Okay, are women any happier? The answer is absolutely across the board no. And then you look at what are the psychological effects of feminism, and you brought it up. End of life, no children. No children. Oh, you got cars, you got houses, you have no children. And then, of course, the other more very practical elements of feminism is the issues of their physical life and the negative influences of the sexual revolution has had on them physically. So here's the deal. The bottom line is the feminist movement and the feminist worldview and the sales pitch is extremely difficult for a young woman to resist. I mean, they're coming at you as you can be all that you can be. You can be just like a man, even though God created him to be a woman. Right? I mean, there is.
Yeah. No, I'm listening because everything you said is absolutely right on the money.
I mean, there is a difference there, right? I mean, now and then isn't there an in between gender of what do they call it? Metrosexuals or something, where you can't even tell if they're women or men. You know, some of these men that are so feminine.
And that's kind of the point too, Tom, is that men have been feminized and women have been masculinized, and now we've got this so-called sexual revolution in play, which, you can be gay, lesbian, you can be transgender, you can be virtually anything, and it's all just fine. Everything is fine except being a Christian, normal, traditional American family. If you're a normal American family, there's something wrong with you.
Yeah, but here's the antidote to that. Here is the biblical Christian contrast to that is that we don't live by the world standards. Our epistemology, of course, it's a fancy word for source of knowledge. Our source of knowledge is the Bible. It's the revealed Word of God. And if so, out of that, we reject the whole world philosophy. We reject feminism. We reject socialism. We reject political Marxism, all of it, and we look to the Bible, the Word of God, for our epistemology, our source of knowledge, our worldview. And in the realm of family, it's the opposite of feminism. Okay, so if I could give any advice, I'm not a minister, but if there was a minister in the pulpit, and I would say give him any advice, is tell the young women in the church to do the very opposite of what they're hearing in the culture, in the media, and in the world. And so the opposite is be feminine, okay? Don't desire to go into a man's world. There's no issue about a woman being educated, having a job.
Absolutely not. I support all.
With that. I would rather have a conversation with an intelligent, educated woman. And by educated, Dan, I don't mean necessarily having to go to college. I'm talking about somebody who's well-read.
Well-read, yeah, exactly.
Well-read. That's the simple two-word solution to true education. And so we're not talking about any of that being negative, but so we do the opposite. And then so we have young women that are conservative or Christian that are looking to marry early. When you have a mindset that you're not interested in marrying till late 20s, and you're going to have fun, you're going to get educated, you're going to go through college, you're going to have fun, you're going to have multiple relationships, you're going to travel. Well, you're not with that mindset. You could have 5 good men that have come across your life that are very marriageable men, but you're not ready because your mind is in a different place. Well, the Christian woman, his mind is set on being married, like Christian women have for 2,000 years, and women of the faith had for many more than that. And so we do the opposite of the world. We marry early, and then we have a love for babies, love for children, and we see that not only listen here, 2 things. We see God's command is to be fruitful and multiply. That is soon after creation, that was an ordinance. Early in the book of Genesis, is to be fruitful and multiply. This is the requirement of a family, of a husband and wife, and especially the mom. And so we see a command from God there, but it's beyond that. Dan, what it is, it's a natural love that women have for children, and that is promoted within the covenant community, within the church. So our women marry early, and in my family back in the 70s, I was engaged at 19, married at 20. My sisters, one was married at 20, the other one at 19, and then the 4th brother, we were really worried about him because he was like 21 and a half. We went, Jeff, what's going on here? You turned into an old man here, But that was in a more Christian era, and it was nothing to marry early. So say to the Christian women, marry early, and then starts thinking of having children. And you have them in your 20s, and you have a totally different life, a life that is full of fulfillment. And it's a life with a woman with a smile on her face. I got to read to you something. You remember, before we end, I want to read Pat Buchanan, who we love. We love him because he ran against the Bushes, didn't he?
There you go.
So that's a whole other episode, I think.
Well, and I think he's quite a guy anyway. But yes.
You love Pat. But anyways, he wrote the book, when was it, back in the early 2000s, 2006 or 2008, I can't remember, of The Death of the West. Let me give you a quote, and he talks about population problems of Rome. And he talked about infanticide, he talked about He talked about the reduction of Roman population. He talked about the avoidance and the deferment of marriage. And then he quotes Will Durant, and I love Durant. He's such a good writer. He says this is Durant. Perhaps the operation of contraception, abortion, and infanticide had a huge effect on the numerical effect of Rome and the Roman Empire. And he says, men married latest, albeit the men that married latest bred least and died soonest. Christians were having children, the pagans were not. Abortion, infanticide, which were decimating pagan societies, were forbidden to Christians as the equivalents to murder. In many instances, Christians reduced exposed infants, baptized them, and brought them up with the aid of the community, of the Christian community. And what he's talking about here is, again, it's in what is in your mind. What is your epistemology? What is your worldview? Not only women, but men. So in the early church, the Christian worldview was the Word of God, and that was pro-family, not like the feminist movement today that we have that's anti-family and anti-children. So I remember reading other authors, Dan, where they talked about the Roman Empire and its decline, where the pagans were negative in a view of children, view them as an inconvenience, which is what the modern woman often thinks of children today. They would routinely leave them, they would birth the child and leave them under the bridges of Rome. And the Christians knew the practice, and they left them there because they knew somebody would pick them up, and the Christians would take the babies and raise them in their homes with their natural children. So their growth rate was exponential beyond their ability to birth children because they had a love for children. So we have, as Buchanan brings out, and as Durant so well talks about or discusses in his book, is that we had a huge growth of Christianity, which in the end dominated the Roman Empire in its decline. So that is, if there's anything, Dan, for the young Christian woman listening today, is be a world changer. Marry early, have a love for family, have a love for children, and make a difference in the world.
Absolutely. And with that, Tom, I have to mention that the humanists believe that human beings are not exceptional. They're not created by God. We are just another animal on Earth, and they look at humans as not being exceptional at all. And all I can say is look at the things that the human race has been able to accomplish because of our intellect and because of all the things that God has given us as gifts that animals do not have. And so obviously the people that see humans as being nothing other than animals, if they want to go away, if they want to die early, that's fine with me, but they ought to leave the rest of us alone, because humans are going to be what solves the world's problems, and that's why God said, be fruitful and multiply, because he knew that our gifts would be what would save the world, not what would destroy it.
Yeah, and I would say, when I wrote this article, I've got, surprisingly, I didn't get a lot of negative feedback like I thought I would, because here we got a man talking about birth rates, and women and having children, which is, I wish the woman would have wrote the article, but anyways, but yeah, I didn't write it for women outside the faith. I didn't write it for non-Christian women. It was really written for women in the faith, and I'm not interested in influencing them, because they've got their mindset, they've got a worldview, and if they don't want to have children, well, so be it. Well, here, the call is to the Christian woman. You want to change the world? Marry early, have children, raise them for Christ, educate them with a Christian education, and we can change the world. I got to tell you a story, as long as you bring this up. I was involved with Christian political organizations, and I was sharing with some of the guys on a board I said, you want to transform society? You want to fundamentally transform America? We can do it in the church. And all you got to do is basically two things. I'm going to put the first two together. like I've repeated many times on this broadcast, you marry early and you have a lot of children, a lot of Christian children. Now, I put in the article, I know somebody's going to be on my case about this, is the minimal family you got to look at, and this was really in the early 60s and late 50s in America, was 4 kids. And it was not uncommon to have 7, 8, 9 kids in a family.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and it's no big deal. And I mean, it's sacrifice. Obviously, it's an effort. It's I shouldn't say no big deal. It is a big deal.
No, it's a big deal. It's a lot of work, but usually the older kids would help take care of the younger kids. It also made the siblings better friends.
Oh yeah, and you know the interesting thing, when your last comment there reminded me, is the best upbringing is when the children are in want. In other words, the opposite of indulging children. You know, I'm amazed. You go down these high schools in the better side of town, the cars in the parking lot. I just can't believe it.
Oh yeah. I
mean, Range Rovers. I mean,
BMWs.
My first 1962 Oldsmobile, or 64? No, 64 Oldsmobile 88 cost me $240. And, I was so glad to get it. My brother and I talk about, I said, Jeff, did we ever buy insurance on those cars? And I said, I don't know. We didn't know anybody in the insurance business. We didn't know where to get it, And it was just, but what happened when we have a large family and there's not a lot of money going around, it was such a blessing to us because it threw us into the adult world quicker. Mm-hmm. And people, this is great that you brought this up because so many people look at it, well, I want to raise my children right, so I don't want to have too many of them where I don't have enough money to really do a real good job on them. But what they don't realize is that when the children lack, because there's a lot of kids in the home, maybe there's 6, 7 kids, it puts them in the adult world and they mature quicker.
Right.
I mean, we were ready to get married at 19. I mean, we were done with the frivolousness of high school and all that. We were on with our lives. The day we got out of high school, man, we were moving. And because we already are in the working world, I mean, because we knew there was no money for us to, to go out to a little restaurant, buy a hamburger, to have a car, or anything like that. So
not unless you earned it yourself. Yeah.
Remember that kind of upbringing?
Oh boy, I started at 8. Yeah, I know exactly that upbringing.
We all had paper routes. We were doing all kinds of things just to get a buck in the house. And those were such good days because we talk about in my family, we didn't even bother asking mom and dad for money because they were, 6 kids, they were struggling. And the dad's business, and everybody had, the dads with 2 jobs. So we knew we just had to go out and get it ourselves. And with that brought a maturity. So young people, you think that when you're going to get married, you're going to only have maybe 2 kids because you really want to take care of them right and give them proper vacations. Let me tell you, the opposite is true.
Absolutely.
They're better off with less to drive them into the adult world, you'll end up with mature kids that will love you even more when you give them less. Mm-hmm. So, how do we get off on that one, Dan?
Well, no, it's important that people realize that, but we are pretty close to being out of time, Tom, but what I want to talk about now, very quickly, I want to approach the church, because you're exactly right. One of the problems we have is that our ministers in our churches, because of their 501c3 tax exemption, are so afraid to tackle any issue that they feel might be politically incorrect. That is what's wrong with our churches today. We need to be able to tackle the real issues and what is destroying our Christian culture. And what you just talked about for the last hour is exactly what is destroying our Christian culture. So why don't they talk about it, and what can we do to make them talk about it?
Well, that you're really catching at the heart of the issue within the church here, and that is the Protestant pulpit. I had I think one of my, trying to look for it here, one of the subtitles in my article on the Birth Rates in the Future of Western Christianity with News with Views, was the Protestant pulpit asleep, or the Protestant pastorate asleep in the pulpit. And I think the pastors, they don't expose the government school systems. They don't talk about Christian education and getting the kids out of these horrible government schools. And they don't talk to the women about what their role is in the church and society. They don't talk about having children because they're more afraid of the congregation losing their job and pension than they are of God. And I hate to bring it up to that point. And I had in the article a little section here called the Bambino Strategy, and I talked about for the churches, we need to start rethinking some of the ministries that are that come out of the church. I said in here, for some of the big churches, it's kind of humorous, is to kill the music minister position, that's $60,000-$70,000 a year position, and start having women's aid ministries in the churches, rooms, to have the music minister's office needs to be turned into a infant baby's clothing office where the women can trade clothing and give it to other women. And they need to start being proactive in the churches on encouraging the young women to marry and to have children. And they just really don't touch the subject. Let me just, we got a second?
We're close to the end, but go ahead. Let's finish your thought.
Here's my last closing argument here, which is my last paragraph in that article. Here it is. It's my call to young Christian women. Young Christian woman, unto you is given a great gift that is unique to your gender, the ability to bring children into this world. It is a gift that comes with a high and honorable calling to be guardians of society and keepers of civilization. Will you take this call like countless generations of women who have come before you, or will you draw back and embrace a life the world offers you, free from self-denial and sacrifice, with promises of personal fulfillment, convenience, and comfort? And that's it, Dan. Dan, that's where we're down to. Which route are we going to go?
Well, I'll tell you what, Tom. This discussion is far too big for a 1-hour program, so I hope you will entertain the idea of coming back. I'll invite you back again very soon, because this is a really, really important subject, and we didn't even get into how other cultures like Islam are literally dismantling the Christian church and destroying it because of our own lack of Christian teachings. And so I would hope you would be willing to come back at some point in the not too distant future, and maybe we can pick up on some of those ideas as well.
Yeah, you know what I love? Let's just do a little free discussion on growing up without money and without Range Rovers as teenagers. How did we make it? How did we make it?
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, if you look at the most successful people, and I really take a certain amount of pride in this, you do too, we were successful because we did deal with issues. We learned how to take care of ourselves. We learned how to make money when we were young. And as a result, we're the ones that the kids now look at and say, well, how did you manage to do that? Well, we did it because that was the culture at the time.
Yeah, all without a psychiatrist. How did we do it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly. Without a psychiatrist and without government programs to pay our way.
Yes.
Yep. Amen. Well, with that, Tom, I thank you for being our guest on the show. I do want to very quickly mention your publishing company and a book that you are publishing right now. I got a copy of, which is a fantastic book about the Reformation of the Church. It's called A New Day of Small Beginnings. And would you like to tell our listeners how they can get in touch with your publishing company and how they can get that book?
Yeah, Dan, thanks for mentioning it. It's ZurichPublishing.org. It's a ministry. It's a foundation I've had for probably about 15 years. We've been working on this one project. French theologian Pierre Courtial, leading theologian in the last century in France, and he wrote a book, A New Day of Small Beginnings, and he talks about a reformation of the church, a renewal of the church, and reviving again the law of God, a law of God that applies to all areas of life and thought. And he leaves the book with a great hope to the believer of a new Christendom that could come, and with Christians that would take the Word of God courageously into the world and into the culture. So you can get it on Amazon, or you can just pull up ZurichPublishing.org and order it, and be glad to send it to you.
Well, and I highly recommend it. I got a copy, and I'm about halfway through it right now, and it is really, really an excellent book. So, Tom, thank you again for being our guest, and I look forward for the next time that we get a chance to get together with you and have you on Connecting the Dots. And
Dan, anytime. Always enjoy it.
Well, I'll tell you, we have a lot of fun. I really enjoy having you as a guest, and thank you again. And with that, I turn the program back over to you, Kelby, and thank you and good night.
Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes this week's show with Connecting the Dots with Dan Happel. God bless. Good night. We'll see you next Thursday, 6 p.m. Pacific.